Good morning, everyone. My name is Vicki McLean. I'm your host today from Tampa Bay Library Consortium. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, How to Conduct a Review of Your Library Liaison and Outreach Program with your presenter today, Rita Vine. Rita is a professional librarian and facilitator who helps librarians deepen outreach engagement and institutional impact while honoring cherished practices and professional values. Rita holds a BA from Western University and an MA and MLS from sunny Buffalo. Rita now splits her time between Tampa Bay area and Toronto, Canada, where she maintains an active library consulting practice. Good morning, Rita.
Good morning, and good morning, everybody. Let me talk to you a little bit about what we're going to cover today. We'll progress in the following way. I will look at the basics about assessing liaison work, what it is, why we do it. I'll talk a little bit about some of the most important literature that I would commend to you after today's session. We'll talk a little bit about the pillars of liaison work, the kinds of things that you can think about when you're thinking about the kinds of things you want to assess. We'll talk a bit about finding benchmarks and guiding documents as you're thinking about your goals and objectives. I'll discuss the kind of methodologies you can use to gather information. The last quarter of my presentation will be regarding considerations for larger liaison assessments. I'm going to confine most of my comments today to things that an individual liaison can do themselves or that small teams or small departments can do together. And finally, how this work makes a difference, and I'll give you some examples. So time for you to find the chat box in your keyboard. I'm interested in discovering from participants, what level of assessment are you thinking about undertaking? Are you thinking about self-assessment just for me and maybe my supervisor? Assessment for my team or department? Or are you thinking about multiple teams or system-wide assessment across your library system? I'm going to take a look at your chats as you're typing things in. Self-assessments and teams, a little bit of system-wide, that's great. Multiple teams and self-assessment, super for your entire team. Okay, great. So I think we're on track because the things I'm going to say should be quite helpful to everybody here today. So I will continue. Let's talk about why we assess. Well, we assess because we want to identify strengths and weaknesses or gaps in our programs or services. I think even more in the last decade, assessment has become expected. It's really central to higher education. It happens across divisions, academic divisions, and it's an internal assessment is a trust measure for institutions. It improves leadership confidence that the work that's being done under that leadership is reaching goals and objectives. It also permits institutions to self-manage themselves, which is really important in higher education. And it mitigates the force of individual opinions. You know, I think this, you think that, who's right? Well, assessment done comprehensively allows us to show what is right and what is valuable and gives evidence to support those assertions. So I want to spend some time reviewing the literature on liaison assessment. This is certainly not everything, but I wanted to highlight these articles because they touch on different aspects that I want to talk about today. And also there's a few articles here from Florida institutions of higher education. I thought those would be particularly interesting to you. So there's two important articles that used very simple surveys to better understand how faculty viewed librarians. Ocala and Jones in 2002 wanted to improve liaison relationships at Baylor University between librarians and faculty. At that time, faculty held the funding for collections in the library. So the librarians at Baylor used a short survey, which was sent to faculty library reps. So at Baylor at the time, every division had its own library rep, an academic faculty member who would liaise with the liaison librarians at Baylor. And that short survey was designed to uncover what the assigned faculty reps knew or didn't know about their liaison. So what did it uncover? Well, it uncovered that they didn't know what their liaison's responsibilities were, and interestingly, that faculty would not necessarily seek liaison help for library-related questions. So that was quite startling, and I think that that demonstrated quite clearly that there are lots of things that we don't know that are true. Similarly, Jonathan Miller at Rollins College, this is in 2014, sent quite a similar survey to identify the ways in which faculty engaged with liaison librarians. And that survey was designed to set a very simple benchmark for continuous quality improvement. A number of librarians have used more complex and longer surveys. For example, Arendt and Lotz at Illinois is probably the largest and most comprehensive survey of its kind in North America. And other authors like Michelle Tennant at the University of Florida also used a more detailed and more complex survey that would have taken certainly more than 5 minutes to complete. Often, in some cases, quite a long time, maybe 20 to 30 minutes to complete. Lisa Horowitz presented at the Library Assessment Conference in 2016, and she advanced the idea of using indicators as a way of measuring faculty-librarian relationships. And she provided a number of really useful examples, and her presentation is in your bibliography. It's a series of PowerPoint slides, but it's full of great examples. She also used a very short survey instrument when she was a liaison at MIT, which yielded some interesting but limited results. And I'm going to have more to say about surveys in a minute. Wood and Griffin described a process to identify faculty teaching and research needs in order to effectively determine work priorities for a 13-member liaison team that served 40,000 students and almost 1,800 faculty at the University of South Florida in Tampa. They didn't want to conduct a survey, so they searched for methods to help the library understand needs across a wide range of disciplinary boundaries without relying on survey responses. I'll give you a couple of examples. To measure curriculum needs, they analyzed published syllabi at the university for evidence of library engagement. To identify research needs, they reviewed faculty curriculum vitae, and they gathered information from departmental websites. Not all of their choices of materials to review worked, but their methods, I thought, were remarkably creative, and they looked for pre-existing information that could be helpful rather than to start from scratch. And finally, Bruce Schoonover and a team from Florida State University described a decentralized liaison program where liaison was not necessarily the librarian's primary job responsibility. And they designed an assessment that focused on competencies for liaisons. The article, which I commend to you, describes how an articulation of core values led to a determination of competencies. So values led to competencies, and that in turn identified gaps, which in turn led to a considerable increase in training activities for liaison librarians. The survey that Schoonover conducted also uncovered what we know to be generally true across institutions, that most liaisons are more comfortable in areas of teaching and less comfortable in rapidly changing areas like scholarly communication and the use of digital tools. This is a very important article, and its appendix has an excellent self-assessment questionnaire that liaisons can use to determine their readiness to enter into new areas of engagement with faculty. So that's the literature. Let me describe the process. This is how assessment can work. First, you'd have to decide what you want to learn. You look for external benchmarks. You find existing assessment data. You figure out which methodologies you're going to use. You collect all that data, you measure results, and you act on the evidence. It's very much like strategic planning in a way. I'm going to move through each piece of the process separately, and please, as we're moving through this, feel free to add your thoughts, ideas, or questions into the chat box, and I will glance over it occasionally. I will be pausing occasionally for questions, so you can also wait for that moment as well. But I'll answer those. I'll answer those as I see them if they're relevant to the slide, and I'll pause if I need to and wait till the break to answer some of the others. Okay, let's start with what you want to learn. This is the big question for many liaisons, and it's really important to consider this at the outset of your project. It's also one of the hardest parts of the exercise because it's so easy to go overboard and to want to learn too much. And you end up going down a rabbit hole that is hard to get out of. So in the next few slides, I'm going to explore some different ways that you can brainstorm ideas for what you want to learn. And then it'll be your job to narrow that fantastic list down and figure out what the most important ideas and goals for you are. So we have practical considerations. What's the size of your institution? How much time do you have? What are your own skills as a liaison? Are you at the beginning, middle, later stages of your career? Have you had lots of experience working with faculty and students already? What kinds of resources are available to you in terms of time and also other resources like survey instruments or other tools that you may need to use? How much time do you dedicate to liaison? Is liaison a primary part of your job, or is it maybe just a small portion of your work that includes other areas as well? What roles do you currently have as a liaison? What roles do you want to have as a liaison? What roles do you think you should have but don't have? And you can add all of that to your initial considerations. These practical considerations and role considerations help you think realistically about the breadth and depth of the kind of assessment that you can undertake. Here's another way you can think about the kinds of things you want to assess. There's a notion of pillars of liaison that exists across our discipline. In other words, the various things that liaisons typically do. This set of pillars is from Ohio State University Framework for the Engaged Librarian. It's available online. And it's very similar to a set of pillars used in the Schoonover article in 2018. So you can use each of these to think about the kinds of activities that you undertake. For example, what kinds of support do you provide to researchers? Support to scholarly communication, support in teaching and learning, and other kinds of engagement. Start to write those down. Also, there's a recent book chapter by John Glover in 2019. It's in your bibliography, and an article by Isabel Silver from 2014 that are really, really useful in just listing the kinds of things that liaisons do. And you will find some things that you do in there, and of course, other things that you probably don't do in your role. This is a graphic from Imperial University in the United Kingdom. I've altered it a little bit. About the kinds of library services that support teaching. Again, another way to brainstorm the sorts of things that you do. So the lavender hexagons are the kinds of activities that take place in teaching, and the purple squares are the typical kinds of activities that librarians undertake to support teaching in their institutions. So again, ways you can think. And on the research side, I love this little graphic, how the library supports the research life cycle. If you work at an institution that supports research, not all of you will. Some of you are from primarily teaching institutions. But if you work at an institution that supports research, we're looking at the life cycle of research in the center blue circle and the kinds of ways that you may already provide service or consultations, or may wish to provide service or consultations as a liaison in the future. The life cycle approach to scholarship offers a huge opportunity space for libraries and researchers to partner and collaborate. What libraries value and offer can and should match what researchers value and need. So think about where you can see inserting yourself in the research life cycle. So I'm just going to take a minute and ask you in the chat box, what kinds of things are you thinking about assessing? I'll take a look at that every so often while you're typing things in. Add your thoughts to the chat box. In the meantime, I'll continue. Oh, I see a question. Do faculty receive enough proactive information from their liaison? That's a really interesting question to ask, and you'll want to think about the kinds of methodologies and ways that you can find the answers to that. So now, moving on in the process, I really like to start by looking for external benchmarks. So I have an idea of my goals and objectives. They seem manageable to me. What can I learn at the highest level of my institution or state about what's important and what's going to be important in the next few years? So I really like to look for state planning documents. There are some for Florida. The State University of the State University System of Florida. There was the 2025 online education goals document. There was a 2019 textbook affordability project document. The Florida Talent Development Council has a 2020 to 2030 strategic plan. These kinds of state planning documents are intended to guide institutions in their development of strategic activities, and they are often a great way to give you a hint of what's in the pipeline for the future and what state governments consider important. So look for those. And I would also say that don't necessarily look for those documents to talk specifically about libraries. They're not going to, but they will talk about things like partnering, lifelong learning, inquiry, resources, and that often translates into assessment opportunities for libraries. So that's your 30,000 foot view. Your 10,000 foot view, of course, are your institutional planning documents. Moving up the chain, you're going to look at your library's strategic plan and your library's goal setting documents, your college or university's strategic plan, and other college and library planning documents. Usually for colleges and universities, the top level planning documents are available online on the open web. Some library planning documents are not fully available online. They may be, and you may have to see if you can find some of those by talking to your administrators. I also like to look at documents from professional organizations. For example, ACRL standards can be useful in identifying benchmarks for approaches. The Ithaca S&R Changing Research Practices series is quite important. So starting about 3 or 4 years ago, Ithaca S&R commissioned libraries to engage in research projects analyzing the changing research practices in specific disciplines. Engineering, religious studies, and those are just the 2 that come to mind, but there's about a dozen of those. They're all freely available on the open web at the Ithaca S&R website, and for those of you who want to engage with researchers, these are really great baseline planning documents that you can look at before you start to seek information from your own community. The ARL spec is from the Association of Research Libraries. There was one produced in 2015 on library liaisons. There's a number of excellent liaison frameworks in those that you can use as guidance documents. For those of you in teaching institutions, the high impact educational practices from AACU provide guidance to many, many institutions in how they frame their teaching goals and objectives, and I think that follows naturally into libraries. And of course, Megan Oakleaf's Value of Academic Libraries, the report from 2012, I believe it is, gives some guidance that you can use as an external benchmark. So there's just some ideas on how to better understand the higher level goals and objectives of your institution as you're thinking about your own individual goals and objectives. Moving on. Finding existing sources of assessment data. So you can save yourself a lot of time by looking for stuff that already exists. A couple of ideas. If your institution participates in the National Survey of Student Engagement, NSSE, you probably have great data already on the life of students on your campus. Again, data that's not necessarily related to the library specifically, but provide linkages to areas that you could connect with, like learning communities, undergraduate research, and other domains outside the library that offer opportunities for connecting, partnering, and supporting as part of a team. Look for other individual campus assessment projects. Also, divisional and departmental reviews in pretty well every university. Self-assessment at the divisional level takes place every 3, 5, or 7 years, depending on the state, depending on the institution. And those reviews can be very revealing in terms of the key areas that have been identified by external reviewers for focus. Department heads and deans are very focused on that kind of advice, and that may yield some opportunity for you to think of some areas that you can focus on as well. Local databases are super useful. Where's your online chat database in your institution? Sometimes there's been analysis done of a chat database that will reveal certain gaps and opportunities. Your LibAnswers or similar database, the number of hits, the analytics on those databases can give you an idea of what's important to your stakeholder community. Instructor and student feedback forms after your instruction class, if you've retained those, which I suggest that you do, even if you just hide them in a drawer somewhere, that can provide a lot of input to you for your own self-assessment. And finally, an underappreciated area, narratives and testimonials. What stories do your stakeholders tell about you and the library and your colleagues? What do you hear that's both great and not so great? What are the testimonials? And what are the nature of the testimonials? Are they focused on um, finding a book or finding an electronic resource? Do they extend more broadly into areas of research and teaching support? You can learn from narratives and testimonials both what you do well and by elimination what you might not be thought of as doing at all for your local community, but something that you would like to do. Here's a tip: keep it simple. Focus on assessing student and faculty outcomes and not necessarily library outcomes. And let me give you an example. So as an individual liaison librarian, think about assessing the improvement in grades for senior capstone papers. Are those grades improving compared to previous years by changes in your involvement or additions to your involvement? Be less interested in how many students use the library resources you've suggested for their capstone assignments. The former, the improvement in grades, is a student outcome. The usage of library resources is a library outcome. I find that it's quite useful to focus on stakeholder outcomes, and that yields more powerful results. Keep your goals modest and minimal in number. I've said that already. And for larger scale team-based projects, if you're thinking of having several people involved, consider establishing a small terms of reference that just provides guidance on what you're going to assess, what your goals are for the assessment, and how you're going to do it. It keeps things contained. When there's multiple people involved in a project without a terms of reference, things tend to get scattered. I'm just going to pause for a moment and just look over at the chat box for questions. Again, feel free to ask me any questions about anything I've said or to provide your own thoughts and ideas here. Moving on in the process, let's look at the methodologies. So you've assembled all the information, you've found what assessment data exists out there. Now this is the stuff you've got to produce yourself. There's different kinds of methodologies that you can use. First one that you're probably really used to are the inputs and outputs. It's the how many question. How many hours, how many students, how many sessions, how many items, how many questions. It's interesting, but I think it's most powerful when it's used with other measures. Alone, it can't really capture the true value of liaison work because busy, as we know, is not necessarily better. Another methodology to consider is the voice of faculty and students. There's two ways to do this. I'm going to focus on the second point first, surveys and focus groups. In the literature review, we looked at a number of articles that used surveys. So here's my take on surveys. It's really easy to do them badly. Especially as they get more complicated. So I think what I found is the longer the survey, the easier it is to make a mistake and not really learn as much as you hope that the survey was going to produce for you. The best surveys that we've seen from the literature are the short ones that only take stakeholders a few minutes to complete. Focus groups can be very interesting for larger scale assessments. I think they're quite important. I don't think focus groups led by people who are stakeholders are helpful. I think focus groups need to be led by people who have no stake in the outcomes. And the reason is that people just won't tell you the truth. If you're the source of their problem. I ran a large-scale liaison assessment project at the University of Toronto over about a year and a half, and we ran a dozen focus groups with librarians and about 5 focus groups with senior administrators and faculty across the university. And in all those cases, we brought in an external facilitator to lead the focus group, both because they could keep the conversation moving successfully, and also because the content that they were able to acquire was much richer and deeper than we could have done ourselves with, for example, a library stakeholder running the group. Semi-structured informational interviews. These are, I think, underappreciated and underused. These are informational interviews that a liaison librarian would have with a faculty member who you are charged with liaising with. Done over coffee or done in their office. You have a set list of fairly open-ended questions. You listen to them, you take notes. If they let you record it, that's great. Then you can focus more on listening to the conversation. You do a lot of listening, and you don't try to really solve their problems. The idea behind a semi-structured informational interview is to learn more about the real lives of stakeholders. I like faculty interviews. I consider faculty the most important stakeholders because at the end of the day, they kind of control the purse strings that accrue to the library. So I think you can learn a lot from faculty in a very short time, and faculty are often the gateway to students as well. So think about those kinds of informational interviews. There's lots of information on the internet and in articles about how to conduct semi-structured informational interviews. It's not that difficult. A non-professional can do it successfully. The most important thing that you need to learn how to do is not talk and listen. Moving on, another methodology, an indicator of impact and a value method. Indicators allow you to participate. Indicators help us understand how we can and do participate in more stages of teaching, learning, and research. And indicators are really respectful of disciplinary differences, which I think for liaisons is very important to understand. Impact indicator in engineering is going to be a little bit different than an impact indicator in geography. And I'm going to talk about indicators more in a moment. And then finally, there's a wonderful tool that we tend not to use, which is just reflective self-assessment, where we ask ourselves a series of questions about our readiness and our ability and our interest. And we don't necessarily share those with anybody else, but it helps us get ourselves. And again, there's a wonderful self-assessment tool in Schoonover. I see a question if there's library literature on the semi-structured interviews. I'd like to see that. Yes, yes, there is. Reach out to me afterwards, but I will tell you briefly so everybody can hear. There's a very nice set of slides from Martin Sang at the University of Miami. TSANG, Martin Sang, at the Reimagining the Library Liaison website section of the Association of Research Libraries. I'll say it again, Reimagining the Library Liaison, Martin Sang. And it's called the Faculty Interview Project. He has a number of suggestions and a series of questions that he has used. There have also been some interview projects conducted by librarians at Cornell University. Cornelia Tancheva, I believe in 2016, with a number of librarians at Cornell, ran an assessment project where they conducted interviews with faculty. You'll see some semi-structured informational interviews there as well. And I'm probably forgetting something, so feel free to reach out to me afterwards and I'll find some more stuff for you. And just one more thought there. you don't need the library literature to show you how to do semi-structured informational interviews. There's lots in the communication literature about that. So a good Google Scholar search will help you as well. Hope that helped you. Okay, back to impact indicators. So an indicator uses inputs and outputs, but creates value based on the relative changes of those inputs and outputs over time. So an impact indicator is designed really to measure change. It quantifies inputs and outputs in the context of desirable outcomes, projects, programs, services, and other organizational efforts. So an example of impact could be the number of faculty who have involved me in their successful grant applications. A successful grant application is an impact, and an indicator of that would be the number of faculty who have involved me. So there's just a simple example of that. Here's some more examples. Indicators of library and faculty relationships. Relationships are really hard sometimes to figure out in a quantified way. So here's your question. What was the nature of my faculty interactions this year? What kind of indicators can I use? What percentage of new faculty contacted me in their first year of employment? What percentage of contacts resulted in a reply? What percentage of contacts resulted in a face-to-face meeting? How many faculty proactively made contact or followed up with me within 1 year? And I'm sure you could think of others, but there's just as kind of there's a question, and there's how we use quantification to measure changes in relational capital. Here's another example. This is an indicator of assignment effectiveness and student learning. So my question could be, how many faculty have consulted with me on assignments that have an information component? My indicator could be the number of percentage of faculty who've done that, the number of students in the course, how many students have I touched through my engagement with faculty. What's the percentage of grade in a course that's assigned to an assignment that has an information component? Has that changed over time? Maybe you have some narratives or testimonials on quality improvement in assignments after your consultation work. And I do want to alert you to a number of additional indicators in your bibliography, part of the ISO information and documentation methods and procedures for assessing the impact of libraries. Freely available on the internet. The link is there, lots more indicators. Rubrics. If you can find them, and there aren't that many, or if you can make them and they're not that easy, they can help you keep on track and elevate your expectations. But they take time to create. Here's an example from Ann Kenny's 2014 document, Leveraging the Liaison Model. This is a rubric that I love this rubric. This rubric defines measures of success for the use of an institutional repository. You can see the goals in the columns on the left, and they actually define good, better, best, and quantifications of measures of success. For me, this is the best rubric I've ever seen in the area of liaison engagement in an area of research. So there's something you can use as a model. Here's another one. This is from Mack and White's 2014 book, Assessing Liaison Librarians, Documenting Impact for Positive Change. This is on page 137. This is a little different kind of rubric. This is more of an activity document, but the Mack and White book has other rubrics as well that you can look at for advice and templates. This particular one is Professional Development Rubric for Outreach and Engagement. It doesn't really define good, better, best, but it gives you an idea of the different kinds of activities that you could measure. This is an example from Lisa Horowitz's presentation at the Library Assessment Conference. I love this one. Tracking your indicators doesn't have to be complicated. This is Lisa's new faculty contact worksheet. One tiny little worksheet, name, the liaison's name, when the contact happened, a whole bunch of yes and no answers. And as these were accumulated, they were transcribed onto an Excel spreadsheet and shared. So you've got a really nice picture of who and how many and changes over time. Often when we talk about tracking, there's a lot of interest in customer relationship management software, CRM for libraries. And again, this is a rabbit hole that's really easy to go down, but tracking can be simple and shareable. This is an example of a really simple comma-separated file spreadsheet that John Bales used in his 2016 article that's in your bibliography, where he simply tracked all the conversations with different faculty members in his liaison area. Again, individual librarians on a team can use the same spreadsheet, commit to using the same columns, and then it can all be accumulated, shared, and assessed later on. So you've got your data, you've looked at it, now what? Now you report and share the results, and you act on the evidence. I love when small teams do this kind of work and share the learning with their colleagues, because especially in big institutions where it's often hard to get buy-in from everybody to agree to an assessment project, evidence from a small team that did it and found that they learned something can be very powerful with peers. So share your learning with your colleagues and your team. Use the evidence from your learning to define performance goals for the next year. Use the evidence to modify how you approach existing programs and services, and take the risk to create and pilot new services or approaches to fill in the gaps. So for those of you who are looking at larger liaison assessment projects, I'll just flip my hat to being part of a big institution. I used to manage the liaison activities of 86 librarians across 3 campuses. This is what big looks like for larger liaison projects. So the first thing is you can use a lot of the tools and techniques from small projects that I've talked about for large projects as well. Self-reflection and indicators can work very well for teams or departments. For much larger scale library assessments where there are multiple departments and everybody has to buy in, there may be some structural or organizational considerations included in your assessment work. You may be thinking, and often managers are, about how to redesign Liaison so it's more effective and efficient moving forward. And sometimes those are structural or organizational considerations. I really like when larger institutions model on existing divisional 3 to 5 year reviews. So you take the model that is used by your provost in assessing academic divisions, and you use that as a guidance document for your own model. I did this at the University of Toronto. It helps with buy-in. Because if it works for the faculties and divisions, it should work for the library. We often consider ourselves an academic unit, and we want to abide by the same principles and practices as the divisions. Large institutions should allow a long time from start to finish, 4 to 8 months. Definitely a terms of reference. You need to think about a budget for this. You will probably want external reviewers to come in the same way they come in for academic divisions. You'll need to pay them a little bit of money for honoraria. You have to pay for them to hang out on campus for a few days. They have to write a report. That takes time. So there is often a cost involved. you'll definitely want to think about facilitating focus groups and think about an external facilitator for that. You may want to conduct some stakeholder interviews in advance of those focus groups. That often helps you think about the kinds of questions that you want your facilitator to ask the focus group, so you're using that time most wisely. And then definitely plan for a fairly long period of debriefing after the reports have been issued. So once the report's issued, then your work is really just starting. You need to share that information out with your staff. Your staff have to accept and reject and talk and debate. And then you have to think about the next steps of projects and implementations. You're spending an awful lot of time and probably some money on this, so you want to make it worthwhile. A report that sits on the shelf is not so worthwhile. So that's a big piece of your consideration in a large project. And finally, I want to wrap up and give you some time to make comments and ask questions. So this is all work. How does it make a difference? It does so many things. It helps us identify underserved disciplines. It may also help us identify overserved disciplines. I can think of one institution that had such high needs in one academic unit that they actually had to assign a second liaison to serve the unit. But after a while, they had to think about dialing back that. So they really had to think about what was the nature of the service, what was rational to provide, what was reasonable to provide with the resources that they had. So both underserved disciplines and sometimes overserved disciplines, imbalances in disciplines. Assessment provides evidence to rebalance workloads for individual librarians. I think we all know, some of us, or we may feel that, man, I'm doing so much liaison and person X isn't doing as much liaison. Wouldn't it be great if we could rebalance some of that? Well, this is evidence to do that as opposed to opinion. Assessment helps us refocus on institutional impact. Again, if you start at the top and you look at the state documents, the institutional documents, you look at what is important to the community you serve, not just advocating for the library, it really helps us think longer and deeper about the roles that we play as librarians. And assessment can reveal opportunities to fill service gaps. It can reveal opportunities to improve our messaging. I'm looking at the comment, do faculty receive enough proactive information from their liaison? I guess the question could be also, do faculty receive the right kinds of information from their liaison at the right point in time, in the right way? There's lots of ways to improve and change messaging. And it can also tell us areas where the library excels and where we can capitalize on that excellence. I want to give you some outcomes of assessment, and I've noted those where there's public information. In some of these, I haven't provided the institution just because that information hasn't been made public. So here's just some examples. In one institution, they created disciplinary teams of liaisons for better collaboration, rather than just have the individual liaisons be silos on an island of liaison doing the best they can without a lot of support. So disciplinary teams, humanities, social sciences, physical and applied sciences, and health sciences, for example. Rutgers University discovered that office hours in an academic department made a huge difference to the level of relational engagement between liaisons and faculty members, and didn't take a whole lot of extra time. Another institution adjusted their librarian annual report format to align more closely with the library's strategic plan, which in turn aligned with the institutional's strategic plan. Schoonover's article for Florida State University, the result of an assessment project, resulted in enhanced training for liaisons, especially in areas of scholarly communication and digital tools. And in another institution, many liaisons felt underskilled in teaching. And so this institution created a central expert library teaching team to support liaisons. So there's just some examples of outcomes. Every institution is different, every context is different, and your mileage will, of course, vary. That's the end of my prepared remarks. We have several minutes for questions, thoughts, and ideas. And I'm very happy to engage with you in the chat box if you'd like to add a question or thought. While you're thinking about that, one of the questions that I have sometimes is, so I would really like to do a department-wide assessment, but how do I get buy-in from my manager, and how will I get a bit of a budget to do some of this stuff? Those are all really good questions, especially in difficult times for many of us at institutions right now. Freeing up some cash is going to be difficult. I hope I've shown you that in many cases, except at the largest institutions, you can do a great deal of good assessment work without really any money at all. Maybe just access to some sort of qualitative research tool like in vivo, or some other kind of statistical analysis tool, which probably exists somewhere on your campus. So don't be put off by issues of budget. Certainly for the largest institutions that have master's, PhD programs, large student bodies and large faculty bodies, there are going to be some costs associated with that. But most of those costs are associated with facilitation and external reviews. And so in my experience, and I did this in a very large institution. I'm guessing that most of you are from institutions that have fewer than 85,000 students. You're looking in the thousands of dollars, maybe moving into the tens of thousands of dollars, which is a lot of money, but for a large institution, there's a lot of learning to be had from this, and you might not find it. Your managers might not find it that difficult to come up with that. I think you have to provide a really good reason, with a really great set of goals and objectives. Do your homework, looking at all those first steps, looking at the benchmarks, state and institutional benchmarks, looking at the library strategic plan, and seeing how you can directly align assessment data with the goals and objectives of institutional and library strategic plans. I'm looking at the chat box, and I'm not seeing any further additions, so I think I'm going to pass this back to Vicki for some closing remarks.